All right, all right. Well, that was exciting. It's good, it got all my nerves out of here. Okay, so with this is our introductory slide, and then we'll get heavy real quick. So I want to start here with a look back to the events of January 6th, the attack on the US Capitol following the 2020 presidential election. These events were encouraged by then President Trump, who denied the outcome of the election and participated in multiple efforts to have those results contested. The events of January 6th were a troubling turn here in the United States, an interruption in the peaceful transfer of power, a hallmark of democracy. But these problems aren't only happening in the United States, they're happening all over the world, and I hope to at least bring some of that into the talk. As a researcher of online rumors and disinformation, I watched the events of January 6th unfold on my television next to my partner, not with shock or even surprise, but with a combination of a sense of horror and also this sense that, oh, at least now everyone else can see what I've been seeing. It's a very weird feeling. Because to someone who'd been immersed in the false narratives about the election for months, we'd been studying for months, the events of January 6th were not surprising at all. In 2020, my team was working as part of the Election Integrity Partnership, a multi-stakeholder collaboration that worked to identify, analyze, and rapidly respond to election-related rumors, misinformation, and disinformation. In the weeks leading up to January 6th, my colleagues and I were deep in the data. Our active response had stopped, and we were looking very closely, doing quantitative analysis of hundreds of different incidents or information cascades where false or misleading claims about the election had spread. And then we'd also been doing in-depth qualitative analysis, reading thousands of different tweets, looking through profiles, looking at the misinformation that was spreading and why it was spreading. And so we'd been looking at false claims and conspiracy theories about discarded mail-in ballots, suitcases of ballots, dead voters, corrupt voting machines, and more. There was just a multitude of false and misleading claims. Through November and December of 2020, discussions around these misleading claims were being integrated into the broader Stop the Steal movement, which functioned both to motivate the sharing of these claims in support of this false meta-narrative of massive and widespread voter fraud, and to mobilize people on top of those false claims. Looking at some of the accounts participating in the Stop the Steal discourse, it's hard to miss the increasingly salient markers of partisanship wrapped into the social media profiles, the identity performances of the participating accounts. The Stop the Steal tweeters were freedom fighters, gun owners, wives and mothers, military members, Christians, and hashtag patriots. On January 6th, many of these social media accounts that I'd once described along with their politically left partners or peers as online caricatures to political partisans, came to life in a violent insurrection attempt at the US Capitol. In my talk today, I hope to explain some about why this happened. Before I go much further, we need to get some definitions out of the way. And I want to note that these definitions are dynamic, with researchers still trying to find the right terms, the right language to describe what we're seeing, and to differentiate different kinds of phenomena from each other. Like everything else in this space, the terms and definitions are also adversarial. The people and organizations that benefit from the use of some of these techniques and from these toxicities repeatedly attempt to co-opt and even invert the meaning of some terms to make it more difficult to deal with the challenges we face. You'll note that I won't use the term fake news except for that one time for some of these same reasons. So let's start definitions with misinformation. So misinformation is information that's false, but not necessarily intentionally false. Disinformation, on the other hand, is false or misleading information that's purposefully seeded and or spread for a specific objective, for instance, a financial or political objective, or reputational. But there's more interesting things about disinformation as we've come to understand it. Disinformation isn't always wholly false, but instead it's often built around a true or plausible core, and then layered with falsehoods, exaggerations to create a distorted perception of reality. Additionally, disinformation rarely functions as a single piece of content, but instead as a campaign or a set of different information actions that work together to create this distorted reality. And that though disinformation campaigns, let me go back. This piece is actually one I want you to note because it's a hard one considering I just gave the difference between misinformation and disinformation is one of intentionality. But it turns out this distinction gets a little bit muddy, because though disinformation campaigns are intentionally misleading, many of the people who participate in them are actually unwitting agents who are sincere, though motivated believers of the content that they're spreading. And this becomes a little bit complicated, but we'll come back to this again and again. In recent years, we've witnessed trolls in St. Petersburg, Russia, manipulating US political discourse in the lead up to the 2016 election. They were manipulating discourse on a lot of different fronts, but that's one that my research team did work on. By infiltrating this, they did this by infiltrating online activist communities on both sides of the political spectrum. We've also seen the Russian governments and its agents, both witting and unwitting, deploy disinformation to shape perceptions around their invasion of Ukraine. For example, accusing Ukraine and the US of harboring dangerous bioweapons laboratories, accusing Ukrainians of provocations, through chemical weapons attacks, and even employing fake fact checks to undermine reporting from the ground in Ukraine. Our research team has also investigated a similar disinformation campaign a few years earlier by Russia in the context of the civil war in Syria, where disinformation targeted, has continued to target humanitarian response and journalistic organizations, in part to provide cover for war crimes by the Syrian regime and their Russian allies. So I begin with these cases of Russian disinformation, not because disinformation is exclusively a tool of the Russian state, and I want to get that and make that very clear, but that this flavor of disinformation is one that has been particularly salient in recent years. It may be ascendant, and it seems to be evolving as it's adopted and adapted by different entities within different cultures and for different goals. If we look back in history and kind of to understand what disinformation is, especially the Kremlin-style disinformation, we often look to the work of Lawrence Bittman. He was his first name was Ladislav, but he changed it when he defected from Czechoslovakia. He was a former practitioner of Soviet disinformation, and he talked about disinformation as one tool within a broader genre of what he called active measures. So we often think of intelligence work or spycraft as information gathering, as information gathering, trying to get what is the other side doing. But active measures, as opposed to passive measures, active measures seek to shape outcomes by manipulating information spaces. For example, stealing documents and then altering them and releasing them to injure the reputation of an opponent. Thomas Reid has a fantastic book drawing from Bittman's work. I highly recommend that you all read it if you're interested in this. He explains, as social scientists, that many of us think of the social construction of reality as a descriptive theory. In contrast, in Soviet and now Kremlin-style active measures, they consider the social construction of reality as prescriptive, a strategy. Active measures seek to shape how people perceive the world in ways that confer political or geopolitical advantage to those who are trying to spread them or use them. Reid explains how active measures can become entangled in activism, seeding activism, for example, with front organizations, infiltrating activist groups and shaping their work from within, and even simply supporting or amplifying existing activism that aligns with its goals. And we see this again and again in our work, where activism and active measures are entwined and entangled in ways that are hard to understand where one ends and the other begins. Reid and other experts of disinformation describe it as a threat to democracy. Pomerantsev and Weiss have this paper from 2014 that was very illuminative for my team when we first started to try to understand what was going on. And they explain that the purpose of disinformation is not to convince, but to confuse, to make it difficult for us to know the truth, or for us to even think that we can know the truth. Disinformation undermines our trust in information, in democratic institutions, and in each other. And pervasive disinformation destabilizes the common ground that we need to stand upon to govern ourselves in democratic societies. I also want to stress that the erosion of democracy is not a US phenomenon. It's happening all over the world, in India, Brazil, parts of Europe, the Philippines, that there's different flavors in different places. For example, in the context of the Philippines, Ong and Cabañas have described how network disinformation campaigns feed a kind of toxic populism. Maria Ressa, a journalist and a 2021 Nobel Peace Prize winner, has been working for nearly a decade to draw attention to how social media dynamics contribute to the silencing of journalism and the rise of authoritarianism in the Philippines. She's become a target of both online harassment and political persecution. The last time I spoke to her, she was under house arrest. And underscoring these dynamics, in May of 2022, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son and namesake of the former dictator of the Philippines, was elected as the president there, in part by using social media campaigns, disinformation campaigns, to rewrite his family's history. Have some water. Heavy, I told you this stuff is heavy. So there can be a 5-hour talk here about how human psychology interacts with modern information ecosystems to contribute to the toxicities that we're seeing today online, not just disinformation, but many of the other things. For example, how our vulnerabilities as humans resonate with the social media designs that make it easy to impersonate others, with the algorithms that optimize for engagement, and with the massive networks that span across the globe and that can become wired for the spread of toxic content. I'm going to have to leave those other talks and the researchers. I don't have enough time today, but to suffice to say, we're acutely vulnerable to disinformation in online spaces. But I want to highlight this last point before I move on, that the participatory dynamics of online spaces supercharge a certain flavor of disinformation, expanding the role of unwitting agents as well as motivated but not necessarily in the loop actors. And I'm going to talk about that today. So, many of us in the United States and perhaps elsewhere really became first aware of disinformation around the 2016 US election, the 2016 Brexit vote. Around that time, the social media part of that story really focused on the fact that disinformation was foreign. It was coordinated. It used inauthentic actors to manipulate domestic discourse in another country. But this wasn't the whole story, but this was a dominant story. It's one of the stories we told ourselves. It's one of the stories that showed up in a lot of the journalist accounts. If you fast forward to 2020, the story around disinformation targeting the US election that year, especially disinformation targeting the integrity of the election, the big lie, this is very different. In this case, it was largely domestic. It was propagated by authentic and in many cases blue check accounts. And it was participatory or cultivated rather than coordinated. And that's what I'm going to try to explain today and highlight the dynamics of. In the weeks leading up to the 2020 election, there were numerous incidents, what we call them information cascades, of false or misleading claims about mail-in ballots. Some of these worked generally to sow distrust in mail-in voting. Others explicitly claimed voter fraud. After the election, a multitude of other claims emerged related to in-person voting, including misleading and or unsubstantiated claims about ballots that were lost and found, glitches, tortured statistics about vote dumps, and false allegations that voting machines were switching votes en masse. These claims became wrapped up together into a broader narrative, claiming massive and systematic voter fraud, and the specific claim that the election was rigged against then President Trump. In October 2020, Bankler and colleagues referred to the effort to discredit the mail-in ballots as a disinformation campaign. And we're going to take that term, and we apply that in our work as well, and extend it to the broader campaign, including the mail-in voting and the in-person voting and the vote counting. Before we go further, we're going to ground ourselves in a shared reality. This set of facts emerges from a range of sources, including members of Trump's own administration, such as former Attorney General Bill Barr, who in testimony to the US House of Representatives and their January 6th committee called the voter fraud claims, quote, BS. These facts have been upheld in numerous court cases that have been front and center in the January 6th committee's work. Joe Biden won the US 2020 presidential election and is currently the legitimate president of the United States. There's no evidence of widespread voter fraud in the 2020 election that would have had an impact on that outcome. And the violence on January 6th was in part motivated by misleading claims about voter fraud and by encouragement from then President Trump. If this isn't your reality, you're not going to like the rest of this talk, and that's okay by me. All right, so this disinformation campaign was seeded from the very top, in this case from then President Trump. This tweet, posted all the way back in June of 2020, I remember it at the time. I screenshotted it then. It was one of several early posts about voter fraud in that election cycle. He claimed that it would be rigged, that ballots would be printed and ostensibly filled out in foreign countries, and that it would be the scandal of our times. The tweet received nearly 100,000 retweets and nearly 300,000 likes. And by this point in the evolution of Twitter's ecosystem, Donald Trump had a huge megaphone with many dedicated followers who would avidly and often systematically like and retweet his content. And through this and hundreds of similar tweets, President Trump set a frame, an expectation among his followers that there would be widespread voter fraud. But the effort to spread the false narratives of voter fraud also incorporated the work of dozens, perhaps hundreds of other elites in social media speak, or influencers, including political pundits, hyperpartisan media, celebrities, political figures, and what we call social media all-stars who have achieved their influence through using that platform strategically. To illustrate this, I'll use one of dozens of these incidents that we followed where claims about mistreated ballots were used to sow doubt in the mail-in voting process. This is an example from September of 2020. It claims, with a photograph, that more than 1,000 mail-in ballots had been found in a dumpster, implying that this had implications for the 2020 election and building on the narrative that the mail-in voting process could not be trusted. The author, Elijah Schaffer, was a journalist at the right-wing media outlet, The Blaze. Perhaps not coincidentally, Schaffer was also inside Nancy Pelosi's office on January 6, 2021, ostensibly in his role as a journalist. But I digress. Back in the September of 2020, Schaffer ended his tweet about ballots at a dumpster with the words "big, if true." Except it's not true. The tweet was missing key context. The image shows ballot envelopes, not ballots. And the ballot envelopes were not from 2020, they were from 2018. They were being recycled according to the law, which stipulated that you had to destroy these 22 months after the election. So it was 22 months after the 2018 election. So this was, the photo was not at all related to the 2020 election, and the story was neither big nor true. But this was a misleading tweet, and it fed directly into the narrative that the election was rigged, and people who were motivated to spread it did. It eventually went viral, tweeted or retweeted nearly 10,000 times. A few hours after Schaffer's tweet, the Gateway Pundit, a hyperpartisan news outlet, ran an article with similar words and claims. I actually have, my screenshot is a little late here. It has it after it was corrected. Very hedgy correction. You see they put the question mark after the correction to suggest it's not true. In any case, before that correction was added, this article spread widely. All in all, we can see this is a temporal graph of the spread of tweets per minute over that time around this sort of set of claims. And there are about 40,000 tweets about this story in the first 36 hours. The pink area represents tweets from that were retweets of Elijah Schaffer, and the purple consists of tweets linking to the Gateway Pundit. So you can see that these two influencers, these two sources, were responsible for a vast majority of the spread of this false story. It spread mostly on Twitter, although it died out and then it echoed back and eventually began to spread on Facebook as well. Here's another view of that spread. It's a kind of graph that we use a lot. We call it a cumulative graph that shows the trajectory of a viral claim and the role of influencers along that trajectory. So the x-axis here is time. The y-axis is the total spread in tweets and retweets at that time. And we've plotted individual tweets along the trajectory sized by the number of followers that posting account has to get a sense of how many other accounts they were exposing this content to as it spreads. And I've colored retweets of Schaffer's original tweet in pink and posts linking to the Gateway Pundit article in purple. Here's the original tweet by Elijah Schaffer here at the beginning of the graph. And then here's how the narrative echoes through other large following accounts of a right-wing and pro-Trump influencers. It was eventually retweeted by the account of President Trump's son, Donald J. Trump Jr., out to his massive audience. We built these graphs for dozens of incidents, and we see similar dynamics over and over again, with false claims echoing through the accounts of increasingly large influencers. So the disinformation campaign to create and propagate the big lie was to some extent top-down. If we look more broadly across the election 2020 conversation, we find a finite number of repeat offenders who were repeatedly influential in spreading content related to the big lie. We create a list of these accounts that were highly influential or highly retweeted in spreading many different incidents of false, misleading, or unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud. And I want to point out, and I'm getting brutally harassed for this list, and I am exceedingly proud of it because we did a lot of work to make it happen in terms of tracking all these different events. And there are folks from the left who appear a little bit later in the table, like about 50 or 75 for spreading things, claiming that the USPS was purposefully trying to harm the mail-in voting process. But predominantly, these are right-wing accounts that just repeatedly spread many different claims, which shouldn't be surprising to anyone, including these folks, because they know that they did this. This was a huge narrative in the right-wing media at the time. So these accounts include the former president and his 2 adult sons, as well as conservative activists and celebrities, political pundits, hyper-partisan media outlets, and QAnon influencers. These and other influencers repeatedly spread false and misleading claims of voter fraud. They set and repeatedly reinforced the frame of a rigged election through which their audiences would interpret their own voting experiences and the experiences of others during the 2020 election. So from this perspective, the effort to push the big lie was top down. But this campaign was also bottom up, with everyday people helping to spread and in some cases produce false and misleading claims that fed into the campaign. In part, they did this because they were asked to. The Trump campaign encouraged supporters to go to the polls or to their mailboxes and gather evidence of voting issues. They provided an online forum at a site called Defend Your Ballot, where supporters could share their evidence with the campaign. They also encouraged their supporters, both explicitly through the reward of retweets, to use social media to share their claims directly with their online audiences. These became opportunities for Trump supporters to contribute to the movement with more than just their vote, and many did. One narrative that emerged from these efforts was Sharpiegate, where issues with Sharpie pens grew into a theory that specifically Trump voters had been disenfranchised by being forced to use Sharpies. The narrative actually began with a number of people posting stories describing how they or someone they knew or heard about had been given Sharpie pens to vote and how the pens had bled through the ballot, which actually happened, and how they were worried that their votes may not have been counted. Officials attempted to correct these concerns on election day. They explained that the ballots were designed to be used with Sharpies and that the bleed through wouldn't affect the vote counting because of how they were designed. And also, eventually they explained that the reason they used Sharpies is other pens smeared the voting machines when you feed them in on election day. But these official statements did little to alleviate the concerns, which grew as more people shared their fears. The Sharpiegate narrative played out over the course of several days. In this early period on election day, there was this low-level conversation in several states about how Sharpies were bleeding through ballots. Initially, the tone about Sharpie tweets was one of concern, worries that the votes wouldn't count, directives to bring your own pen. But as time went on, the content took on a more suspicious tone, reflecting the existing collective belief that the election would be rigged. In the early morning of November 4, the day after the election, conversation about Sharpies began to pick up in volume and to focus exclusively on the state of Arizona. This trend began shortly after Fox News called the state of Arizona for Joe Biden, as Trump supporters attempted to explain why Trump had lost in that state. That loss was unexpected for the Trump campaign, especially at that moment, which may have stymied plans for Donald Trump to claim victory on election night. After the Fox News Arizona call, the discourse shifted from concern and suspicion to the explicit accusation that this was an intentional effort to disenfranchise specifically Trump voters. That shift occurs as the claims began to gain traction. Many of the tweets at this time came from local voters in Arizona, and you can see that they authentically believed that their votes had not been counted. For others, online political activists from around the US and the globe began to repeat the claims with this voter fraud framing. They would sometimes retweeting, but sometimes creating their own tweets to say, look what's happening in Arizona, they're being cheated. Then suddenly, around 9 in the morning Arizona time, or 4 p.m. UTC, the conversation around Sharpies begins to just really take off. This is the day after the election. And let's look at the cumulative graph that I showed you before of that time. This graph shows the narrative first gaining traction and then exploding in this gray section. Not surprisingly, we see here during that explosion some of the same pro-Trump influencers that appeared in our repeat offenders table above, including conservative activist Charlie Kirk and Trump's 2 adult sons. These repeat offender accounts were pushing the Sharpiegate narrative right as it began to go viral, likely as an explanation of why President Trump had apparently lost to Biden in Arizona. Much of the spread was catalyzed by a tweet from conservative activist Matt Schlapp, who, if any of you know political history in the United States, was actually at the Brooks Brothers riot in 2000. But his content here resonated through the accounts of other influencers, colored red in this graph. And you can see that some folks have impact among audiences and some folks have impact among influencers. He had impact among influencers. Now, the discourse faded. It was actually pretty effectively corrected on that first day. Some of the local accounts actually corrected themselves, deleted their tweets, said, oh, we learned this isn't true. But the narrative surges again. It comes back on November 5th, so 2 days after the election, after Fox News personality Maria Bartiromo repeated the false claim that Sharpies were invalidating ballots, along with several other misleading claims that emerged in the days after the election. She brought those claims together as part of this broader narrative suggesting that Trump lost due to massive voter fraud. Her tweet received more than 30,000 retweets and spread through 35,000 quote tweets and retweets of quote tweets. And this is what's happening on Twitter. These things were also being repeated on cable news as well. And they echoed through accounts of influencers and everyday people. So this is just one example. Many of the other kinds of incidents that we followed this same dynamic. And if you kind of step back, President Trump and his campaign didn't just prime their audiences to be receptive to false narratives of voter fraud. They inspired them to produce those narratives themselves and then echoed those false claims back to them. Social media allow for this two-way exchange between populist political elites and their audiences, these grievance feedback loops. And participatory disinformation like this can be very powerful. Participants can become extremely invested in these narratives. Let me zoom in on one particularly insightful example. It's almost heartbreaking. On November 4, the day after the election, the Sharpiegate narrative is spreading widely. And a number of people began to share evidence that the Sharpies had caused their votes to be invalidated. And this is an example of them. And this tweet was retweeted more than 10,000 times. It contains the claim that this person's ballot, which she had completed in person via Sharpie pen, had been canceled. And so she has this attached screenshot, and there it is, right down there. It says ballot status canceled. And it appears that this poster sincerely believes that her ballot had been canceled because she used a Sharpie pen. She had gone online, filled out this form. This is what she found. But if you look more closely at the image she shared, it was captured from a web form that gave people the status of their mail-in ballot, which was by law canceled when they voted in person. Perhaps there's a lesson here for web form designers, and we can talk about that another time. But this evidence that spread in support of false claims around Sharpies and voter fraud was a misperception and a misinterpretation. And this misinterpretation, like so many others, from misinterpretations of glitches and statistical anomalies and ballot envelopes in a dumpster, it became wrapped into this collective experience of being cheated. So many of these folks weren't just told that they would be cheated or that they had been cheated. Many of them actually had this false experience of being cheated. And I doubt that corrections of their misinterpretations will change the feelings of those experiences. I want to get to the conclusion here with an illustration of this participatory disinformation phenomenon that I've been working on. It's not perfect, but let's try it. This sort of visual explanation of the dynamics between political elites and audiences within participatory disinformation. So in this model, we got the political elites on top and the audiences here. So the political elites repeatedly spread the message of a rigged election, which set an expectation of voter fraud among their audiences. And this became a frame through which events around the election were interpreted by their audiences. The online crowds generated the false and misleading stories of voter fraud, reinforcing that frame. Sometimes these stories were produced intentionally with knowledge that they were false, but other times they were generated sincerely through misinterpretation. Grassroots activists and social media influencers helped to amplify these stories, passing the content up to the political elites. Political elites echoed the false and misleading stories back to their audiences, reinforcing that frame and building this sense of collective grievance. As the audiences echoed and reiterated this growing sense of grievance, violent language and calls to action increased, both from the audiences and elites. Then political elites began to mobilize and organize those audiences. We saw calls to action, for example, to call lawyers and file affidavits, to attend rallies and protests. And one of those led to the violent attack on the Capitol on January 6th. So again, participatory disinformation makes for this powerful dynamic. It's enabled by social media, which I've been focusing on here, but it also implicates the broader the broader media ecosystem, such as cable news, hyperpartisan media outlets, as well as members of the political establishment. These tight feedback loops between elites and their audiences seem to be making the system more responsive, but also may be leading it to spin out of control. This may be one of the things that social media does, is put that conversation between the elites and the audiences, it put them in closer conversation. And we see similar dynamics supporting right-wing populist movements in Brazil, India, the Philippines, and elsewhere. Elites don't just cultivate their audiences. Audiences cultivate elites. We can see that right now if you go look at what's happening with Elon Musk and how right-wing audiences are trying to cultivate him to take certain stances on things. And the social media dynamics seem to strengthen this effect because it can put them in conversation. So what are we going to do? The participatory disinformation campaign to spread the big lie is ongoing. There are more, we're doing our rapid response again in 2022. There are more false claims spreading now about the 2020 and 2022 elections than there were at this time in 2020. This may become a permanent part, or at least a short-term permanent part, of election-related discourse for several cycles to come, endangering democracy and the peaceful transfer of power here in the United States, but we're also seeing this exported to Brazil and other places. More broadly, the participatory disinformation dynamics that I describe here can and will be tapped into for other efforts for political and financial gain for geopolitical advantage. This is just one piece of a larger toxic puzzle about around online toxicity and its impact on our social and political worlds. So what can we do about it? And I think maybe in Q&A we can go into this a little bit more, but I have a couple of directions. And the first one is, we likely cannot moderate our way out of the current toxic state of social media. Not to say we shouldn't have moderation, but I don't think that's going to be enough to solve the problem that we see ourselves in right now. Dealing with trolls from foreign disinformation campaigns was one thing, but addressing participatory disinformation, which is produced and propagated by sincere believers, is a much harder problem. And even if we could moderate ourselves to a healthier state, any successful effort to do this will be met with resistance by those who benefit from these dynamics. And we've seen that play out again and again. And I feel like our team is in the middle of one of those cycles right now. We need new social media paradigms that take into account and address what we're learning about human vulnerabilities and interactions at scale and the problems with engagement-based social media environments. But it's not so simple as, and I've heard folks like Ethan Zuckerman talk about taking the ad model out, and I think that might go somewhere, but I don't think that's such a simple solution. We've got some thinking to do as designers about how the next generation of these platforms might work and how to get people to move to the next generation of platforms. There's also implications for education. We need to be conceiving, evaluating, and teaching new information literacies. I don't talk about why people kind of get confused here in this talk, but there's a lot of good research on the social psychology of misinformation that is pointing us into new directions, especially as we learn about how we're accessing information online. But one of the things we do see is no matter what we teach people about how to make better decisions, if the systems don't give them the information they need, they can't make better decisions. And so we really need to think about designing online systems to support new information literacies by not just letting people see the information in front of them, but see who generated it and how it got to them. And we should be seeing these cumulative graphs of how this information got to us, so we can understand who's been incentivized maybe to get us that information. And there's implications for policy as well. And it's way too simplistic to put on a single slide, but I think we need new policies that promote transparency of social media environments, that protect privacy, and those two are often in tension with each other, so we have to think through those. And things that can protect freedom of speech while preventing harms from information manipulation at scale. And these are hard problems because we have to balance these trade-offs in many of these things. Finally, I want to leave you all with this, a slide I needed to revisit today. There's no single simple solution that rights this ship. We're not going to take out one little piece of the puzzle or the whatever, mountain of whatever it is, and have it all kind of come crumbling down. We're gonna need to come at this problem from many different directions at once and with resolve. We're at an all hands on deck moment, especially among folks in this audience. That's why I was so excited to have a chance to speak with you all today. Things some of us have come to take for granted, like living in a world where the arc of history bends towards justice, aren't granted. I think many of us are coming to realize that. Many of us probably realized it long ago, but it's a moment where things seem to be turning in a darker direction. And the systems we built, which some of us once considered systems of liberation, that were gonna democratize everything and bring new people into the conversation, have been co-opted for something else entirely. And we need to figure out what we can do to begin to chip away at this, one tiny impact at a time, in our courses, in our research, policy advocacy, and whatever other ways we can contribute to positive change. And with that, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank my many collaborators. This research is it emerges from a massive collaboration, both at the UW Center for an Informed Public, but also with our partners at Stanford, the DFR Lab at Graphica, a ton of students and postdoctoral scholars, and many funders who have helped us do this work. Thank you for your time. And apparently I get to take questions, but only easy ones.
Hi, that was an excellent talk. I especially appreciated your description of the false experience and the misinterpretation. I myself, I'm Melissa Osipek, I'm at the University of Illinois. I'm currently working on an edited volume on everyday misinformation, sort of these small things that we don't think about. And what really resonated with me with your talk is this idea that this person sent out a tweet about a real feeling they had, and it kind of exploded, probably in ways maybe they were hoping for, maybe they weren't. Do we know anything about what that experience is like for just that sort of voter who suddenly is a right-wing talking point?
That's a great question. I have a student doing research on these spotlight moments where a person has a small account and they suddenly go viral and try to do some. We don't have that research yet. He's still working on it. I don't know. It's difficult for us sometimes. We used to be able to do interviews based on some of our data when I worked in crisis informatics. These folks don't respond to requests often after some of these things happen. But from their log data, when we go and looked at some of these folks, and I tried to obscure them a little bit here, there are some that felt bad, that deleted their content, that said, this has been corrected. I still believe we're being cheated, but this one isn't true, is some of what they said. And there are others that seem to be angling for that kind of attention. That's the feedback loop, that's the motivation, that's the incentive. To get retweeted by one of your influencers, your celebrities, that is a great incentive to contribute. So I imagine there's a variety of different reactions. We have seen that folks actually tend to post a little less after they have one of those moments because they feel like the world is now watching them in a way that they weren't before. But we're still kind of getting to the bottom of that research, and I'm sure others can work on that as well. It's a really good question and really interesting.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I wanted to ask about, you were talking about the solutions and you said there's not really chip away options that you can take away one thing. But I was wondering, Donald Trump has been removed from Twitter, and have you seen any differences in how this discourse is shaping up since then?
Yes. I have so many slides I had to take out of this talk. One of the things we did was we actually looked at the networks after the mass suspensions after January 6th. Donald Trump's account, it's actually like this big black hole right in the middle of the red and the dark section there. Donald Trump's account went, but a lot of other accounts went as well. And interestingly, they went from one section of the graph here. There's supposed to be an orange section there. It's all black, the black accounts, and there's a network graph based on sort of influencers. accounts that were repeatedly retweeted by the same accounts. It's a sort of derivative network graph that tries to get at like where the influencers were in the conversation. And this was the structure before those suspensions, and then in black are the accounts that were suspended. And a huge section was knocked out. And that section was a lot of weird accounts that had 100,000 followers and 100,000 friends. So they had used, a lot of them had used follow back and other kinds of manipulations to grow an audience over years. Some of those accounts have been around since about 2012 and after. And so this huge section of like middle level influencers was taken out as Donald Trump was taken out. And it actually, if we look at what's happening up until this week around election misinformation, is there are a lot of different narratives, but the influencers aren't participating in the same way, in part because they may be or may have been afraid of getting labeled or running afoul of Twitter's policies. But with the takeover at Twitter that happened this last week, those policies are now in flux. They may not be there anymore. And so we actually may see, we have almost a natural experiment for what happens where we've got a huge section, a policy goes into place, huge section of the graph is taken out. We can kind of see some effects on how people are interacting. And now the policy is taken away and we might see things go back. So I think in the next week, we're gonna know how much change that is. And I don't know if Donald Trump comes back. Certainly if he comes back, it does change the amount of just eyeballs. Our eyeballs are there too. It's across the political spectrum. We all find it to be like a train wreck and we all watch it and it drives the engagement over there. And if he returns, we'll get back into some of these loops again. But right now, those suspensions did sort of calm the role of influencers a little bit in this space, but I expect that to reverse.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I'd like to do the sports analogy, if I may. Stanford women's basketball does not win the national championship every year. Steph Curry and the Golden State Warriors don't win the NBA every year. Here in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Steelers haven't won a Super Bowl for a while and aren't doing very well this year. My point being that most people here in America, at least, accept winners and losers in both sides of a sports competition, whether it's basketball or football, or right now we got the World Series baseball going on. One of the reasons for that is presence of referees or umpires. If you take out moderators from the information wars in social media, how do we know which side wins or loses? So given your past in basketball and sports, what is the alternative if we do not have the equivalent of moderators or if we do not have the equivalent of referees?
Yeah, I'm not advocating for taking out moderators. I'm saying that it's not alone gonna fix the problem. I think one of the issues is, to keep using the sports analogy, I have a parent who never thought that we ever lost a game fairly. It was always the referee's fault. We've got a situation where nobody trusts the referees, and not nobody. That, you know, maybe whichever side is having the policies used to take down their content, lose trust in the referees. And so the folks that we're seeing in these conversations don't trust the referees anymore. And they've used that both to just discard the meaning of the labels, but also to shift. I don't know if you're following this, you're not, you shouldn't be. I don't even want to send you out there because I hate to smear myself by letting you all see this content. But for those of us that were doing this work to call out misleading content, we've now been called censors, right? So they take any effort to call out misinformation, to call out this manipulation, and you're accused of being a censor of free speech. Well, that's happening to the platforms as well, and really putting them back on their heels. We've seen that happen in other places, but it puts them on their heels where they get this kind of political attacks that say you're censoring, you're violating free speech, which makes it very difficult. So I guess what I'm saying is that the trend in moderation right now, especially on misleading content and propaganda, is actually, you can see them stepping away because they're getting all of this political pressure about it, and not just from conservatives or from people on the right. So I really do think it's a combination of moderation, but also design, literacy, and policy have to kind of all come together to make a difference here.
Thank you.
We have to end the session in 2 or 3 minutes, so we can just take one more question.
Okay, one more question. I'll try to keep my answers short.
My name is Tara Zimmerman. I'm with Texas Women's University, and I'm part of a couple of IMLS grants where we're looking at misinformation at the elementary, middle, and high school levels and teaching children around that. But the question that I have is that I feel like there's a parallel between like your Sharpiegate example and some of the ways that I feel like there are these coordinated attacks on school libraries and libraries in general and their legitimacy, and the feedback loop that you showed of people going and finding these examples and saying, oh no, look what's happening in my library. And so even though it's not on the same scale as what you're doing,
Yeah.
I see a lot of similarities there, and I wondered if you might have any advice for researchers working in that space.
I don't know if I have advice, but I have you're not inventing something. This is there. When we actually go look at the influencers that were spreading misleading content about the elections in 2020, a lot of them have moved on to attacking libraries, to anti-trans content, and to other kinds of narratives. And we may see them go back to the election-based ones, but and they're using the same tactics in part as, getting people mad about those things and using it to mobilize. And they're mobilizing on top of misinformation again. And local libraries are in their crosshairs because it's useful for the narrative that they want to tell. Same thing for trans people. I mean, if you just see what's happening, it's just horrifying to see some of the propaganda that we'll just see when I kind of go to some of these accounts and see what they're up to. So in terms of solutions to that, I don't know. I think good people have to call this out, and we have to do the work and show what's happening and show it's coordinated by the same accounts and the same techniques that they've used to do these other kinds of campaigns. But I do feel we're back on our heels, and because if we do that, we're called censors or whatever. But look, look what's happening in terms of censoring libraries and really kind of pushing against liberties in other directions. So it's a hard moment, but you're on I think that work is really, really important, both to teach young people, but also to highlight where libraries and others are under attack right now. Thank you. All right.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was wonderful and something that we all needed to hear. And now after this, we have 3 parallel sessions. So those of you who signed up for the early career research mentoring program, either as a mentee or a mentor, please make sure you go to the Chartier room, which is on the same floor. And the rest of you can choose the sessions you want to go to. So thank you so much for attending this opening plenary. And thank you, Kate, again.